something that I feel that is missing in this process is really the United NATO and the United NATO position on the situation. And it's a pity somehow that NATO partners are reading from the news what are the proposed peace steps for Ukraine and Russia. And this happened through the leak. So this just shows that as a political entity, NATO has not been working properly in preparations.
The Trump administration has set a deadline of this Thursday for Ukraine to agree to its 28-point peace deal negotiated with the US and Russia, seemingly heavily favouring President Putin's position. For example, Ukraine would have to cede territory which it has defended and currently occupies. That includes much of the Donetsk Oblast, which would become a demilitarized zone. Ukraine is also being told to cut down the size of its army and to provide and only to receive in return vague security guarantees, with membership of NATO ruled out. So let's speak now to Pekka Havisto, who was the Finnish foreign minister from 2019 to 2023. Hello to you.
Hello, good to be online with you.
Negotiations are clearly underway in Geneva at the moment involving European nations. How much of the proposed 28-point peace plan do you think needs to be changed before it becomes something which Europe could accept?
Well, of course, the problem is in the process, Ukraine has not been involved so far, and the European partners have not been involved so far in these discussions. These Geneva talks today are the first opportunity to influence. Second problem, of course, is the contents about Ukraine losing its territory, Ukraine also losing parts of its sovereignty because the size of the army, or to be a NATO member in the future or not to be a NATO member in the future, should be only a decision by Ukraine and NATO, of course. And then comes the question of the implementation. This is a very sketchy agreement. And there's, of course, people can be afraid that this reminds very much of the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements earlier in the past that were not in reality implemented. And that was a problem earlier.
But in a sense, we know Donald Trump famously said to President Zelensky of Ukraine, you don't have the cards. And is he not apparently pressing an advantage for Russia at a time when Ukraine is facing difficulties on the battlefield, but also facing political weakness at home because of a corruption scandal?
Well, this is true that Ukraine is in an extremely difficult situation now, and of course, Ukraine's defense, of course, depends also on U.S. support. And if U.S. is not paying and if U.S. is not allowing its military material to be transferred to Ukraine, definitely Ukraine has not so good cards in these circumstances. And as you rightly said, the domestic political situation is not the best one with the corruption scandal and so forth. So this is a moment, of course, that Russia in that sense has an upper hand in the situation also militarily.
Your country, Finland, took the major decision to join NATO. Is this a moment, do you think, where the European members of NATO actually need to step forward and say to Ukraine, we will give you all the support you need to maintain your position, rather than to cave in to Donald Trump?
Well, something that I feel that is missing in this process is really the United NATO and the United NATO position on the situation. And it's a pity somehow that NATO partners are reading from the news what are the proposed peace steps for Ukraine and Russia. And this happened through the leak. So this just shows that as a political entity, NATO has not been working properly in preparations. And I think the European NATO could and should be strengthened in these circumstances. It's about our own security. And of course, support to Ukraine is one pillar in the European security. And I think serious talks are needed between US and European NATO members on how to proceed. And what kind of support we should give to the Ukraine at this moment.
Because, rather than accept apparently Russian and American demand that there's no chance of Ukraine joining NATO, there are those who say that the only way really to defend Ukraine would be to say, yes, we would support you for membership of NATO.
Well, that has been the Finland's position all the time, that if Ukraine wants to join NATO and if there's a green light from the NATO member states, then the NATO membership for Ukraine would be quite natural in these circumstances. And I think there should not be any agreement to limit the full sovereignty of Ukraine to decide about their own future and own alliances. Of course, something that is also in the perspective now is the Ukraine's European Union membership. And of course, European Union has become maybe more this kind of security or defense union than earlier.
Where do you think, if something along the lines of this plan were to be implemented, where would Finland's security be?
Well, of course, we are an independent country and we make our own decisions. I'm still fully convinced that Russia is not directly threatening NATO members or NATO member states. But of course, if this kind of agreement that has now been proposed will be the real agreement between Ukraine and Russia, of course, it has many weaknesses. One weakness is that all the war crimes are not investigated according to this agreement. And of course, this weakens the whole international legal system, and of course Ukraine losing its territory, maybe 20% of its territory, so that you can win through the war more territories and you can neglect the international rules. That's not a good position, not for the Europe, not for Finland.
Pekka Haavisto, former Finnish foreign minister, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's turn now to Victoria Coates, who was Deputy National Security Advisor to Donald Trump and also Special Assistant to the President. Hello to you.
Hello.
Do you interpret this, as many people in Europe are doing, as basically Donald Trump taking President Putin's side?
Well, I don't. Not surprisingly, I think President Trump is the first person, and bear in mind, we're looking at the 4th anniversary of this war coming up in February. So President Trump is the first one to try to hammer out the parameters of a enduring peace agreement. I think it's very important that we have the precedent of the Middle East peace agreement that he put together this past fall in conjunction with not only our Israeli, but our Arab regional allies. I think that should be the model for this one. And we have, Secretary Rubio, Steve Witkoff in Geneva today to begin those consultations. I actually just got back from Helsinki and Vilnius last night, having a lot of discussions on these topics with European colleagues to try to figure out what the best way is to bring an end to this horrible war. And as Pekka was just saying, with the goal of having Putin deterred from going into NATO. And I think that has to be the very powerful message here.
As you know, the Europeans and the G20 have both said that as it stands, they think there need to be significant changes in the peace plan towards Ukraine's position. What do you see as and Donald Trump has said this is not his final proposal. So what do you see as the areas for concessions?
Right. That's critical. That the president did say, I believe yesterday, that this is not a take it or leave it for Ukraine, but a proposal that he is trying to get, as I said, to an end to this war. So I think what Ukraine can look at is very specifically, what are those security guarantees? Why is this different from the Bucharest Memorandum? And my understanding from my travel was the two things we're looking at very seriously are Eastern Front border security. That's something Finland obviously has the most experience of anybody with, and they're taking their Eastern Front with Russia very seriously. That can be extended south through other NATO partners with borders with Russia. And then that technology, that system can be shared with Ukraine. So wherever that eastern border is run for for the time being, that is secure for them. And then the other area in which this has to be really ironclad and very, very serious is missile defense. Everybody's been giving sort of what they have on the shelf to Ukraine over the 4 years of this war. I think we need to both revisit comprehensive NATO European missile defense against Russia, and then also look at how that can be, that umbrella, that defensive umbrella that should not trouble Putin at all. Nobody ever went to war with a system called missile defense. So that umbrella could be extended to Ukraine as well.
And why rule out NATO, ultimate NATO membership? That would seem to be the best guarantee.
Well, I mean, I've always objected to making NATO membership into a messaging device. And there are reasons Ukraine wasn't in NATO in January of 2022, many of which are valid today and are being revealed in the domestic corruption scandal you were just discussing. There are standards for NATO membership. So you can't just say, I'm going to put Ukraine into NATO at any given time.
But there are a lot of countries that have been taken in from Eastern Europe.
Well, right, but they fulfilled they fulfilled the criterion for membership, and they weren't in an active state of war, both of which are very difficult, I think, for a number of NATO allies, not just the United States, to consider. And on top of that, I mean, I agree with Pekka. I think what would be much more productive is talking about getting Ukraine into the European Union, which is something that our European partners, if they are serious about incorporating Ukraine, again, that's an economic union. That's not something I think Putin can complain about, but it is a way to further integrate Ukraine into Europe.
And what's your understanding of the security guarantee which the US would provide?
Well, the language that I've heard sounds very much like Article 5, which is not actually particularly well understood. Article 5 opens the possibility for military action in the event of an attack on a NATO member. It does not necessitate or dictate that military action be taken. And so I think most Americans would be comfortable with that language if you wanted to use Article 5 as a model for that.
One of the unique aspects of the plan as it stands is that the United States would actually profit out of this peace deal, that it would be in a joint investment fund with frozen Russian assets. It would be paid for its security guarantee. Do you think that's legitimate?
Well, I think it's perfectly legitimate, and I think there are a whole host of different mechanisms that might be explored. President's talked about this before of joint.
I mean, isn't it Ukraine that should get any assistance, having been attacked, subject of an unprovoked attack from Russia, rather than Trump's America?
No, I think that in this case, both Ukraine and the United States, which has, if you think about it, provided rather a lot of assistance.
Yeah, so a lot of people. I mean, so the Germans, so the British. We're not asking for money out of this deal. Trump is.
Well, that is absolutely, I think, within the rights of the American president to say that this is something we're going to work with Ukraine on to perhaps pay back.
To make ourselves richer.
Well, and I think you should take a look at the EU structure of providing loans to Ukraine. Are you going to ask for those to be paid back? We have not asked for any of our assistance to be paid back up until now, but the EU has very carefully structured all of this, so it will be paid back. I don't think it's wrong at all for the president to imitate our European partners and allies in that.
Okay, Victoria Coates, former Deputy National Security Advisor, thank you very much indeed to the United States, of course.